Welcome to another edition of Teach the Geek interviews. My name is Neil Thompson. I'm the founder of Teach the Geek. I work with technical professionals so they can present more effectively, especially in front of non-technical audiences. And you can learn more about that at teachthegeek.com. Again, that's teachthegeek.com. Today, my guest is Justin Windle, and he's had more than 20 years of leadership experience across major financial institutions. And in this episode, we'll explore why communication often breaks down between technical teams and business stakeholders, how storytelling shapes data-driven decision making, and what leaders get wrong about analytics, AI, and governance. And we'll also discuss the communication skills technical professionals need to influence strategy, build trust, and connect complex work directly to business value. Welcome to Teach the Geek interviews, Justin.
Appreciate you having me.
First question: what issues do you typically see in terms of communication gaps or breakdowns between technical teams and business stakeholders?
I think it's a pretty common, I would say, disconnect versus a breakdown. It's just a matter of different mindsets. When you think about developers, we're very technical, more analytical, and we're focused on the specific delivery. When you talk about a business person, it's when I first started getting into it, I felt their head was in the clouds. Like, how can you even think through that way? It doesn't make any sense, and I could not bridge that gap. But they're actually very grounded. They know what they need to do. It just doesn't make sense to a pure analytical mind. So I think that's the biggest thing that I've seen is just a different thought process. It's almost a different language. And I spent a lot of my time learning to be the interpreter.
Yeah, I totally understand that perspective, and you're right. It is kind of like a different language. And when I first started this podcast and YouTube channel, Justin, it was based on my own struggles when I
Yep.
worked as an engineer, having to give presentations in front of management, and I had to do it on a monthly basis. And it's similar to what you said. I just assumed that what I was saying was made perfect sense because it made perfect sense to me. So how could it not make perfect sense to you? But yet
Absolutely.
I get a whole bunch of questions afterwards that I thought I'd answered during the presentation. And I'm looking at these people like, how are you running the company?
Yeah. And you can get frustrated because your message isn't getting across. And then the business people are getting frustrated, and then you're losing credibility because you can't speak it in their language. So this is very helpful. What you're doing is helping the technical people learn to bridge that gap.
Yep, 100%. So in the event that you are a technical person and you have to present in front of people, but you see there's a bunch of different types of people, which tended to be the case for me when I had to give presentations. There would be the CTO who would be rather technical, but then you'd have perhaps the COO who's not as technical and the CEO who's not as technical. Maybe the salesperson would be in there sometimes. He's not
Yeah.
technical at all. But so how would you suggest a technical person give a presentation to a mixed audience?
Well, it starts with understanding what the actual business problem is. And I think a lot of CTOs, CIOs, CDOs, like the people on that far end, they're trying to drive the company versus trying to drive to specific business results. And if you don't take the time to understand what they need to cover, then you're never really going to get through. And I think the biggest thing that I've been looking at recently is how do I position everything that I'm presenting in a way that docks directly into what matters to them. So if you think about on a sales side, they're like, how am I getting my top line revenue moved, right? How am I getting those numbers moved? And you have somebody like a CFO, they're looking at how am I controlling the bottom line? What are our total expenses? What's our total across the board? So you need to be able to dock those pieces into it. So if you think of I used to have software engineers that reported to me, and we would always focus in on we're doing the things that directly impact the work that's being done. So we're either reducing overhead and increasing efficiency to allow you to do more things, or we're doing things that are actually creating new opportunities. And it's all driven by business needs. So starting with kind of what that, like who's at the table, to your point, you might have a large mix. So you can't just create one piece for each person because the message would just not land. You need to look across what's the more universal component, what is going to matter to all, and that's how the business is moving forward.
Driven by business needs. Yeah, that's definitely not something I thought about when I was giving those presentations
No.
in front of
Yeah.
management at all. And you know what was so interesting is my project ended up getting canceled after a
Yep.
number of these meetings that I was doing, these project status updates. And this happened over 15 years ago at this point. And I still look back at that time and think, man, if I was just better at communicating the usefulness of this issue, of this product, or this project, and then giving them information that they needed to have to make more informed decisions. That may have been able to save the project, but I suppose we'll never know.
Yeah, and it's nothing's more frustrating when you put all that work in and then it just gets canceled, right? But I think that there's different levels to it. The first is realizing there's the gap in the communication. The second is doing that base layer, and that third is finding a way to become the strategic advisor. So they know that you understand their business and they know you create the art of the possible. So you can identify things they're not even thinking of and ways to enhance. And now that we're in the AI era, there's a ton of that. And I think it's more, I spend more time grounding people about what AI is really going to give us versus chasing the shiny object, but still understanding what they're looking to do and saying, let's find that right fit. Let's enable you. And then that starts to change the dynamic of the conversations in totality.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I'm a bit embarrassed to even admit this, but when I worked as an engineer, I knew that money ended up in my bank account every other week, but I never thought about why.
Yeah.
All I thought about was I'm here, I'm working as a product development engineer. They gave me this project to work on. I'm doing the product development part. They told me I had to be a project lead, which meant I had to give these presentations in front of management. I told them what I was working on and what I thought that they needed to know to make decisions. Obviously, it wasn't the case because the project ended up getting canceled. But then
Yeah.
now, looking back on it all these years later, I just think to myself, what they had to sell stuff. Like business matters. They have to sell a whole lot of stuff to be able to pay your salary. And if they're not paying, and if they're not selling, then you're out of a job.
Yeah. And knowing that end to end is something most people don't get in their career. And I think that's where I've been fortunate is I've worked all three lines of defense in banking. So the actual group that does the selling, I ran the predictive dialer. So I had to make sure they were getting the calls made and getting connections. And then I did all the reporting for that. So I saw how that started to tie together. Most people don't get that kind of end-to-end view. And it's what makes a huge difference. And that's why when I have teams, the only thing we focus on is what's really going to move those needles. Because you're right, that's what's going to even drive your own paycheck.
Yeah. When your paycheck's on the line, then all of a sudden you care.
Absolutely.
Okay, so when it comes to what do you think are the most common misconceptions that perhaps the business-minded people have about, technical teams, and how does that misconception shape decision making?
Well, there's different ends of the spectrum here. One is they think they can just do whatever. I can put whatever's in front of them and it'll just happen. Well, no, there's a lot that happens behind that, right? How do we actually get there? Is it feasible? Do we have the current ecosystem to accomplish that? Is there a dollar associated to make that happen? There's definitely a disconnect in what's possible versus what's possible today. This is where I spend a ton of time. If people go to, more C-suite and CEO directs go to conferences like, oh, we got to do this now. I'm like, those people that are saying they're doing it, they're not really doing it. We can get there, but here's what it means. And here's what you need to do to make that work. They don't understand that. They just think it's going to happen. So that's one gap. And I do think it's maybe not a misconception, it's just a reality that not enough tech people spend the time understanding the business. So they don't know how to write good business requirements. They think they can just put some basic pieces in their language, again, the language gap, and you should be able to interpret it. And you should be able to get exactly what they're looking for. Where I've seen that fail a lot is that tech people are afraid to go back and ask a follow-up question. Help me understand what you're trying to do here. I get the baseline, but I'm not really sure what that means in practice. And that will give you the difference of the actual implementation and increase the adoption rates.
Yeah, I mean, all these questions are ones that I never even contemplated when I worked
Yeah.
as an engineer. It's all about that's the technical part. That's what they hired me for. They got business people. They do their part. I do my part, and everything just kind of works out. But I mean, you're right. There's this gap that exists. And if you're somebody who's interested in speaking so that you're understood, well, it would make sense for you to learn the language of the people that you're speaking to.
Yeah. I tell my team, write it in crayon. And it's not meant to be an insult to the people receiving it, but you got to understand that not everybody speaks at the high-end technical language. You've got to make it simple. And if you and we my boss was even saying this, like we're getting ready for board work, and she's like, make it so a fifth grader can understand it. I'm like, have you ever seen Are You Smarter Than Fifth Grade? I missed a lot of those questions, so I don't know if that's the right term. But I stick with that writing in crayon. Just make it super simple that anybody picking it up for the first time that knows nothing about the technical side and say, oh, I get it. This is why it matters.
Yeah. And what's so interesting about that, Justin, is that even these, people who are technical and they've worked years in these technical fields, they forget that they weren't always technical.
Right.
They
Yeah.
likely they went to school, likely studied something technical, and then got a job in a technical role, and then been doing it for however many years, and gaining that expertise over all those years. And then they go to speak to somebody who likely didn't go to that school to get that degree, doesn't have that technical role, and then they just assume that they'll understand what it took you years to understand. And
Yeah.
just, well, how is that even reasonable to expect?
Yeah. I got tagged with that label quite a bit when I was younger. I had a little bit of an ego going with that and then couldn't communicate up and just, uh, there were probably a few meetings I would take back where you just have the communication. Like, I just don't know why you're getting this. Why is this so difficult for you? But you're absolutely right. You spend a lot of that time building that muscle and building that competency. And somebody else is going to a completely different school. They're sales. Now put a tech person in a sales role, see how well they do. Usually doesn't work out. So we've got to respect the talents of each group and find a way to kind of work together, find that Rosetta Stone where you can kind of talk to each other and then start to build the collaboration.
Yeah. What role do you think storytelling has in a technical person communicating with a non-technical audience?
So the further you go up the chain, the more important that becomes. I did a podcast not too long ago, and I said the primary role of a chief data officer is the evangelist, and they have to be able to tell the story. They have to be able to get buy-in. They have to be able to do these things. That becomes one of the most critical things, especially when you're talking about board interaction or executive leadership team. It is all about the story. How are you making it so it connects and resonates, or you're going to run into exactly what you came into, where it just gets canceled because they're looking at across all these different things that are going on and they're saying, where am I going to put the dollars? Where are we going to put the resources? And if your story doesn't tell me why I need to do this, I'm not going to do it. So it's a muscle that I say start to learn early. If you're early in your career for software development or on the technical side, why does this matter? How do I put it together so it resonates? The better you do that, when you're in that C-suite position, you're going to have a lot less trouble, A, getting into C-suite position, but then B, actually getting your things move forward and showing the value that you bring in that role. It's absolutely critical once you get higher up.
Yeah, yeah. And you know what's so interesting about that is when I was told about the importance of storytelling, it was a shock to me because I just
Yeah,
assumed that what storytelling, what am I, Dr. Seuss?
right, right.
I'm not here to tell stories. I'm an engineer. I'm here to tell you about the technical part of the project I'm working on, and it's supposed to be obvious to you what needs to happen next. And no, you're absolutely right. When it comes to as you move up within an organization, being able to tell that story about why this is important. And you said it. The company has many priorities, and if everything's a priority, nothing's a priority. So we have to have a
100%.
list of the various things that we're going to work on. And if you're not good at selling this story, well, hey, you might be out of a project, and you better find something else to do.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think where I went wrong a lot early in my career is I started to get technical about it in that story. I started to talk about all the nuts and bolts in it. And because that's what got me excited is understanding those pieces. And then I just watched all the eyes glaze over and you've lost your audience.
Yeah,
So bring it back up. Try to find their language. And I encourage people just to try different things because if you pay attention as you're speaking to how people are responding, you can know what's landing and what's not. If they start to kind of doze off, if you see it kind of glaze over, if you see them kind of start to look at their notes or their phone, you've lost them. Focus on hitting what matters. And again, the deeper you go in the details, like if I start digging into why I'm using this version of SQL code or why I kind of use this program or why I'm building this AI tool or what LLM I'm using, they don't care. They want to know about the results. Focus on what is it going to get to them and why does it matter to them, and you'll have an engaged audience.
yeah. I think especially when it comes to giving presentations in front of audiences that are non-technical, it really helps to figure out what that call to action is. What do you want them to
Yeah,
think or do after the presentation? And then you
absolutely.
you work backwards to figure out what do I need to tell them that will lead to that call to action. And what that does is it eliminates all that information that you think's interesting, but it doesn't help them in making decisions based on what you say.
Yeah, and there's you brought up a good point, kind of the call to action, right? That's to me is always my anchor. If I have a call, if I need something done, that's always the last thing I want there because that's what's going to be the last thing that sits in with them. But I always start with what is the problem they're facing. So I want them to come to the table quickly and say, "Oh yeah, that's the problem I'm having. This is burning my day to day. I spend so many calories doing this. and then talk about that art of the possible, what we can do to correct it and how to get there, and then anchor with what do we need from them. Example here, like I do a lot of work with CDOs and in the data space, and we have to clarify and clean up the data. The data is not fit for purpose. So I'll do speaking engagements where we'll talk about everybody jumping to AI. I'm like, great, AI is the carrot. You want to go to AI. I get it. Here's what we need to do. We need to solve our data problem. And we need to do proper data management. We have quality, lineage, metadata, all those things. And we can get there and we can enable the AI and we can do all those things you want to do. But I need this out of you, X, Y, and Z over this time frame. And if we can do that, we can build to that. And that helps them get away from you're just asking for more work. You're starting with here's the problem you're dealing with, here's how we can solve it, and here's what we need from you to get there.
Yeah, especially now we're in this AI world, and if you're a senior executive, that's not the non-technical senior executive, you go on LinkedIn and you'll read all these posts about people using AI and how it's going to be the future, and it's made our productivity go up by X%, and you're looking at your own company thinking, well, what are we doing with that? Where's our CTO? I need to have a conversation with him.
I have that conversation at least once a week now, Neil. I mean, all of that's coming up, and it's funny because I talk to them. I was like, I'm in those. I speak at those conferences. I pull those people aside after they present and say, tell me where you're really at. Okay, well, we're really trying to figure this and this. I was like, okay, so you're the same place everybody else is. But CEOs, I mean, when you get to that level, they almost have to have a little bit of an ego and say, I have to be better than the next. I have to drive this forward. So when they hear that, it kind of spurs them like, okay, we've got to get ahead of this. We're way behind. And that's a trap. So we have to be smart about not just saying, no, you're wrong, you heard it wrong. That's not the case. We've got to be able to communicate, here's where it's doing it, here's where we're seeing value, and here's where some of those peers are doing that. Here's where we can get there from a technology lens. Here's what we can absolutely do to get there that'll benefit you. Again, that's a much higher level conversation that you've got to get to. That's kind of more on the mastering of that, telling the story, but it's important. You've got to be able to see that bigger picture and help ground them a bit without making them feel like you're telling them they're wrong.
Right. Yeah, it's very important to be tactful. That's for sure. So I'm curious, Justin, when it comes to you and becoming more effective at communicating as a technical person with non-technical people, what did you do to improve at it?
So there's a couple different things that have occurred. One is I had to take my lumps and get some things wrong, right? And I've been fortunate. I've had a couple really good leaders in my career that have helped me, but one pulled me aside. So when I first got into being an executive, I thought everything was great, and I she had me go through this business or emotional intelligence courses. And it did it what they call a not customer 360. It's just a something 360. And it basically had interview people about me, which is my direct reports, senior leaders above me, and others. Senior leaders above me love me. My direct reports were disconnected. And then even when we found a couple spots where I just wasn't getting things through. So I spent time, like actually I have one of my books back here is Emotional Intelligence 2.0. I started getting fascinated with that concept, is understanding that every person responds different and hears things differently, even the exact same message. So how can I adjust the message to where it reaches a broader audience and doesn't hit triggers for different personality types? So I've done multiple like personality surveys throughout my career, and I was always the one off the charts, like the technical and dominant, like off the chart. And I'm like, okay, I probably got to soften that a bit. So doing some internal work and saying, okay, what's not working, what's not landing, and how do I work on that myself to improve that effectiveness? That's been one of the biggest things that I've had to do is spend the time on learning myself.
When you were talking, Justin, it reminded me of a question at least I used to ask a lot of my guests is, do you have a leadership style or do you lead based on the way that your direct reports respond to leadership? And when you were just talking, it just reminded me of that question and the importance of speaking to people in a way that they can take in, as opposed to just
Yeah.
saying, this is how I say it. You're supposed to understand it the way I say it, and that's it. And because
Yeah.
if you do it that way, I mean, people might think, well, he's the boss. I got to do what he says, but
Yep.
they may not be all that happy about it.
Yeah, you gain. There's a difference between people working out of fear, like fear of losing their job, and like, hey, this is a person extremely stern, or out of loyalty and respect. And the loyalty and respect is going to get a lot better results out of the people you're leading. So it's extremely important. One thing I will caution, Neil, is I used to think I had to adapt to every single person, but then you lose your own identity. So you've got to set your own frame of where you're at, but learn how everybody's going to respond to that and have those conversations. I was actually a little too loose coming into some of my roles because I like to bring people in, let them be involved, let them have a voice. But if you don't get really clear on the direction, they don't know where to start and they get disconnected. So it's extremely important to say, this is the direction, this is where we're heading, this is what we're going to do. Like even here, we're going to make sure everything we do is docked in a business need. We're going to spend our time communicating with the business, understanding their needs, hearing what those pieces are, and everything we're going to dock back into that. That's one piece. But then saying, guys, here's my direction. Challenge me. Tell me anything you feel we could do differently, anything we can do better, anything you feel is maybe not landing. Let's talk about that. So I make sure it's an open environment so they can do that. But I found that if you're too accommodating to all those styles, they just start to kind of run over that. You lose your own kind of sense of identity and it just becomes a little bit chaos. So there's a blend where I have my standardized approach, my standardized focus, my standardized leading style, but I'm in tune to everybody I'm working with. So I understand how to kind of work with them to get the best out of them.
Yeah, it certainly is a balance, and I think you're right about that because ultimately everyone has to pull in one direction. But you
Yep.
want people to feel like or think that they have a say in that direction. But you ultimately they have to understand that as the top person, you make the final call. So yeah, I was able to tell you what I thought about this project and what we should be doing. Okay, great. I take your feedback into consideration, but ultimately this is what we're going to do. And
Yeah.
that then the people just have to be okay with that. And if not, then find another job. But guess what? If you find another job, you'll be faced with the same thing.
Yeah. And it's tough, right? Because and actually I just responded to somebody on LinkedIn about this, I think over the weekend and said the number one job in a senior leadership position is to hire people smarter than you. So you have to hire the people that are experts in those areas because you're covering a broad area and then get the best out of them, which also means getting out of their way. So I need to set the North Star and say, this is where we're going. This is what's important. But then say, you tell me how you're going to do this the best way. You tell me you're going to do this the best way. And let's make sure it's docked in a top vision. In tech, I think it's extremely critical because you're hiring people that are probably way ahead of you because tech's changing every 6 months. Like even more so now the people that are coming up, they've only known like some of them are just like fully fluent in AI already, like way ahead of where I'm going to be. I have to be realistic in what I know and say, I would rather hire somebody that's smarter than me in this and then just give them the latitude to execute, but within a set kind of parameters what we're trying to focus on.
Yeah. I'm a big proponent, obviously, based on the podcast and YouTube channel, on the importance of technical people
Yeah.
improving in communicating, especially with non-technical people. But when it comes to what an organization can do to help in that effort, what would you suggest?
No, that's a great question. I think there's a couple things to think about. It is one is how do you do broader team engagement? Because I think if you break the initial hurdle of realizing people are still humans and people are still people and start to connect with them on that level, there's less initial friction. I think that's a problem. I've done this way too long. I actually started in tech in the late 90s and I've seen it throughout my entire career. There's a this wall between those groups. So the earlier you break down that wall, then the communication starts to improve naturally, and they're willing to accept that there's some disconnect in language because they now see him as a person. That's one piece that's helpful. Then there is I served a role in part of my career where I was a program manager, but I served as kind of that liaison. So sometimes having a group that's really like, how do I keep the program moving forward? How do I communicate between those two? And then giving the feedback to each group of like, hey, this is what landed and what didn't is important. I don't know that I've seen a magic bullet yet, Neil, where I can bring everybody together and everybody speaks great afterwards. Everybody's speaking the same language, everything's working perfect. I think it's just a combination and repetition of getting people together. breaking down some of those silos where possible, and having people just starting those conversations because the more they speak, the better they're going to start to find some cohesion across.
Yeah, and I mean, also it starts with people being open to learning that new language.
Absolutely.
Because
Yeah.
if you really don't want to be in a position where you got to force people to understand the importance of this. Although I will say that in a lot of instances, that's not really necessary because they'll experience the gap and they'll experience the
Yeah.
frustration of like myself, my project being canceled and me thinking about it all these 15 plus years later.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, you definitely it's definitely something that I think a lot of people, at least as long as, for the further along they go in their career, they'll understand the importance.
No, I agree. So I'll give you an example right now. So I had to build a second line data risk oversight program from scratch. Didn't exist, build it from the ground up. One of the things I did is I brought in my team, risk experts, executives at Wells, et cetera, coming to work for me. And we built a great team, but the communication wasn't there. So I built standardized monthly meetings with that first line. Let's just talk about everything that's going on, just complete open conversation. This is kind of the judgment-free zone. Let's have good conversation. Let's know what's going on. And we started to build that. What I noticed though is the specifics of what was being asked wasn't clear. So I had my team start to document it out. And we started to say, this is what we're needing, this is what we're looking for, just being and then having the conversation. And then when they had questions coming back, we started to adjust how we were approaching the questions. Okay, we asked this, they heard this. That was not what we intended. How do we adjust our question to get that to land? So spending time paying attention to what's working and not working, back to what I mentioned, is extremely important. But we also talked about kind of building teams a little bit. You have to pay attention if you're a leader, if you have somebody that's creating that dynamic, creating the chaos or creating the negative energy, that's a negative component you've got to consider. You try to coach them out, and if you can't, you have to move them out because that one person will start to create like sow that chaos throughout, and it's going to make it almost impossible to get things done.
Yep, absolutely, 100%. This has been a great conversation, Justin. Thank you so much for being a guest. How can people get in
Absolutely.
touch?
Sounds good, Neil. Thank you.
Yeah, so how can people get in touch with you?
Oh, sorry. So LinkedIn is one good way. Justin Windle on LinkedIn. I try to respond to as many as possible. Unfortunately, I get a whole lot of vendors so, in different components, but I do like to do that. I do have posts I'm adding on there, try to help people get some different pieces. And I do speaking engagements for, if you're in the Columbus area, I speak at CDO Magazine, which is a very good event to go to, and in Telecom Global, which is a little more curated. Those are probably the top areas is if you're in that area. And then LinkedIn probably being the best.
Excellent. Well, everyone, that marks the end of another edition of Teach the Geek interviews. My name is Neil Thompson. I'm the founder of Teach the Geek, and I work with technical professionals so they can present more effectively, especially in front of non-technical audiences. If you want to learn more about that, you can go to teachthegeek.com. Again, that's teachthegeek.com. Until next time, take care and stay safe. Thanks, Justin.
Thank you.